Okay, I hope you can all hear me okay. Microphone seems to be working. I'm from the north of England, so I've also been told to moderate my accent, so I'll do my best.
Please.
I'll make my usual mistake of trying to answer the question, but I'll reorder it slightly. So the first question is, will the ceasefire hold? Second question, a bit about who's who in the election. And then thirdly, what are the prospects for sort of overcoming the impasse and changing Ukraine in the way that people want, the original demonstrators on the Maidan wanted? Well, first of all, the ceasefire. Ceasefires tend to work. Wars tend to stop if you have one of three conditions. Number one, somebody has won. Number two, both sides are exhausted. Or number three, the status quo makes strategic sense. Unfortunately, none of those three conditions really hold. You have temporary exhaustion, but no more. Most importantly, if you look at the territory that Russia now holds in East Ukraine, it makes no historical, economic, or strategic sense. It's simply the result of the to and fro in the fighting. This is in Ukrainian, but hopefully it's still reasonably clear. Can't really point. Red is the border. Red and green is the border. So the grey area is the area controlled by the pro-Russian forces on the 12th of September. And that's the area they controlled on the 25th of August, i.e. Earlier. So if you look at the extra territory that Russia has, it's slightly more defensible. This map shows railways in the area. So the good news for Russia is basically that it now controls the railways over the border, the main issues of transport. That's both good and bad news for Ukraine. It's bad news because Russia can pour in all the men and materials that it wants. Potentially it's good news because it could mean that the region could be supported economically from Russia, particularly from Rostov, which is the nearest town over the border. But people in Kiev see three possible reasons why Russia might want to go further. Traditionally, the area is supplied by Mariupol, which is this town that you probably hear about in the news all the time on the sea. The Donbass is full of heavy industry, steel, chemicals, mines. Basically, traditionally, imports come in via Mariupol. They make stuff. Exports leave via Mariupol. So it's not just because Mariupol is a big town, it's basically key to the traditional economic life of the region. So it's tempting for Russia to take that. There's not much west of Mariupol. So if Russia did take Mariupol, it would be tempting to carry on and open up a land bridge to Crimea. Because that would also solve lots of other problems. This is in Russian, but that shows how electricity gets to Crimea. That shows how gas gets to Crimea. And that shows how water gets to Crimea. So basically, if Russia occupied that red area, it would solve all those problems of sort of technical supply of Crimea. Thirdly, however, again, that's mixing my languages. This is a Russian map. When Putin talks about Novorossiya, he talks about the entire area, from the Donbass in the east to Odessa, and even parts of Moldova in the west. So the Ukrainians are extremely worried. Russian discourse implies that they will do more. The Ukrainian side is not reconciled to peace either, unfortunately. Their army was not destroyed, contrary to myth. It suffered heavy casualties, and Russia was able to create the impression that it could act at will without Western assistance. That was basically why it persuaded Ukrainian forces to sue for peace, but they still exist. So temptation number one, this is former Interior Minister Yuri Lutsenko. I won't read out the quote in full, but on the 9th of September, he directly compared Ukraine today to Croatia in 1991. The analogy being that Croatia initially lost to Serbia. Serb forces occupied part of the ethnically Serbian parts of the Srpska Krajina. 4 years later, in 1995, in Operation Storm, they had built up their armed forces and they kicked the Serbs out. Now, that's a terrible analogy. Russia is a much tougher opponent than Serbia. Croatia had a lot of help from America and from the Croat diaspora. But this is what some Ukrainians are saying. You know, we haven't been defeated. We must rearm. Second temptation. This is actually in English, but it's not a very good map. It shows plans to divide up the Donbass. So basically, the Russian area would be the grey area, and the light blue would be annexed to neighbouring Kharkiv, the pale blue to neighbouring Dnipropetrovsk, and that Mariupol area in yellow would be a new kind of independent oblast. And this may happen de facto in the elections anyway. In these areas, there will be voting. In the grey areas controlled by the Russians, obviously, there won't be voting. And there are some discussions in Kiev about formalizing this division. So, the election could not be more important. In terms of who's who in Ukrainian politics, it's a proper election, more or less. And who does well will determine the way forward. For example, how many votes the party of war, the parties which favour continuing the war actually get will be hugely important in terms of decision-making after the election. Constitutionally, this is an election to Parliament. Ukraine already has a new president. He was elected in May, but they've gone back to the old constitution where Parliament has more power. So the election is about Ukrainian statehood, what borders that state will have, how strong that state will be, whether that state is even a viable project. It's also about the unfinished agenda of the uprising. So how many members of the old guard are able to again be elected to the parliament? The answer is actually surprisingly many. Kiev is not as revolutionary as you might think, partly because of the way the election is designed. Half of it is proportional representation, half of it you have elections in single territorial constituencies. And that's where a lot of odious, blatantly pro-Russian figures from the old regime are thought to be likely to be able to buy their way back into parliament. On the other hand, we'll have to see how many new post-Maidan forces enter parliament. There isn't really a Maidan party as such. You have particular individuals spreading out amongst particular parties, which is a weakness. Right? There's no one single party you can point to and say, these are the good guys. There is one party you can point to and say, these are the bad guys, and it's number 2 in the polls. It's a bit like Vladimir Zhirinovsky's old Russian Liberal Democratic Party. It's loud, it's populist, it's actually quite nationalist, but it's fake. It's paid for by oligarchs who are close to the former president. It's kind of Trojan horse to get their guys into parliament. So on the surface, the election is clean, but there's plenty of kind of dirty tricks below the surface. The government camp is split. President Poroshenko will have his own party. His prime minister, Yatsenyuk, is campaigning on his own. It's a bit crude to say he represents the party of war. He represents the people who say we should not give up the hope of eventual military victory. And if his party does well, clearly that will change the atmosphere after the vote. Your final question, what are the prospects for things to get better? Well, the military prospects are not good. People expect the campaign probably not to be interrupted, and then the winter probably to be that Ukraine will have to deal with much more urgent matters of economic pressure, gas in particular. So people expect things to come to a head in the spring again, but Russia could easily make a move before then. In those circumstances, it's extremely difficult to deliver on the basic tasks of reform that Poland has achieved in very different circumstances with much less Russian pressure that Estonia has achieved. But if that's impossible, that is a terrible, terrible message for the entire region, which is basically the Ukrainians have had 2 revolutions and they've both failed, so nobody else should bother trying. There are some good factors. Ukraine has a very strong civil society. Its media is relatively free. We can provide some kinds of support, but the whole point of Russian pressure is to trump all that. And at the moment, Russia looks like it has the upper hand.
Gracias.